Thank you, Norma. I'm glad to be here. Hi. I was thinking this morning as I was getting dressed about what I was going to say. I have a firm rule nowadays because I used to be a very, very organized, rigid person, and I'd always have notes. And I'd spend so much time writing notes that I never got into what I was saying. So I've made a resolution to be spontaneous, which is not always easy, especially facing a group like this. But I was thinking this morning when I got up about our speaker today, our guest and our host, in a sense, who has come to share this day with us. And it reminded me of when I was growing up in California on the fringes of Hollywood, and I became a fan. And I know a lot of you are fans also. At that time, the thing to do was to be a fan of a movie star or stars. Lately, I've changed my group of stars to include a very heterogeneous group which goes from Henry Aaron to Judy Collins to Buckminster Fuller, and last but not least, Robert Theobald. The first time I ever became aware of Robert Theobald was when I heard someone use the term Theobaldian, and that really intrigued me. I thought, wow, wouldn't it be neat to have your name attached to something? I didn't understand what the something was at that time, but I made it a point to find out. And I went out and I bought some of his books, and I read his book on the guaranteed income, which was a little bit beyond me because economics isn't exactly my field. But then I moved on to Tegg's 1994 and Futures Conditional and some of the other books that he's written. And gradually I became more and more of a fan of his. And I'd always hoped to meet him. And little did I know last fall when I said yes at that luncheon when I'd planned to say no, that this would be an opportunity for me. I think that having known Bob now for less than 24 hours, that the feelings I had about him are totally justified. As I look at the list of people that I admire very much, and including Bob, they seem to share certain qualities. They are all people who care a great deal. They are people who commit themselves, are willing to commit themselves to what they believe in. And they are also willing to challenge whatever an existing situation is. They have courage. I think of what the theme of this conference is, which is change. And interestingly enough, Bob, of course, is a futurist. And all things that concern the future really basically concern the present. Because if we don't do something in the present, the future is beyond our control. If I hadn't made that decision last fall, then the future would have been different for me. And so I think of all we really basically have right now is all of us being together for a day. We have, as I say, a guest and a host in Robert Theobald, and I like to think that if we commit ourselves to this day, that we may all come away from it with more of a feeling of where we're going and how we can get there, or at least with the questions of what needs to happen in the here and now in order to do something about the future. Another thing that flashed through my mind this morning was a poem that I also remember memorizing as a child, which was written appropriately by Rudyard Kipling, who was the poet laureate of England and who was a fellow national of Robert Theobald, and also was very interested in India, which is where Bob was born, in Madras. And I'm sure most of you have heard it. It begins, if you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim. And the last part of that poem I think is very appropriate, both to Bob and to all of us who are here today. If you can fill the unforgiving moment with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything is in it. And what is more, you'll be a man, my son. I present to you Robert Theobald.
It's nice to get an introduction that helps and doesn't hinder. Very rare. Because I think the time has come for us to stop running conferences, or indeed doing any transfer of information in which we pretend that it either should not, will not, cannot change the people who are involved. We are in a period of history where we will either learn how to change rapidly or not enough, or we will not survive. Now, obviously, that is not everybody's conclusion. But what I want to try and convince you of this morning is that it is the right conclusion. And then I hope that some of you will come back this afternoon to find out what I think we can do about that conclusion. Because if the only conclusion is that things are hopeless, I don't know why any of us have bothered to be here. Certainly I wouldn't be here. Because it would seem logical and intelligent to go home and to establish some intelligent relationships with one's nearest and dearest and live out the time we have left. So I'm not here to tell you that things are hopeless, but I am here to suggest to you that if we continue to move in the directions that our culture is moving in, that we do not bring about major change, essentially everybody in this room, not only the young people, are going to live into a period in which life will be intolerable. Now that, of course, as people say, doesn't sound sensible, or in Galbraith's term, it offends the conventional wisdom. But I suspect by now we have discovered that the conventional wisdom is the one thing we can be fairly sure is always wrong. And if you look back just 1 year and think what has happened in that year, and if you think what is almost certain to happen in the next year, and the next year, one realizes fairly rapidly that our situation, if we continue in the present direction, does look at least unpleasant, and maybe very unpleasant. Now, the problem is we don't seem to be able to come to grips with this issue. I want to suggest to you the reasons why we cannot. I want to suggest to you that the people in this world, and I suspect the people in this hall, live in what I call 4 different science fiction worlds, in which reality, whatever that is, gets perceived in such incredibly different ways that one cannot talk in any effective way with each other. Let's take one example of how this happens. The energy crisis is at least 4 different things to different people, or different types of people. In one case, the energy crisis is simply a case of minor mismanagement. We can anticipate that the forces of the market, etc., will create a glut of energy in the 1980s, and we can anticipate that nothing fundamental has happened. The second view of the energy crisis is that this is the beginning of the end. Things are going to get steadily worse. There's going to be steadily less and less energy, and we're going to have to get used to a very rapidly declining amount of energy for every one of us. The third view is that if only we lived sensible, decent, human and humane lives, there would not be an energy crisis. And therefore, to look at the energy crisis is an irrelevant thing to do. We should be looking at what is wrong with our lifestyles. And the fourth view is that essentially the energy crisis and all of the other things like it simply challenge us to come up with a better management system for the earth. That man is now in charge, or humanity hopefully will be in charge of its own evolution, together with the rest of the environment, don't get me wrong, and that is the lesson to be learned from the energy crisis. Now, the problem is that on the op-ed page of the Times, for example, the New York Times, on any given day, you can find all four of those views. And the result is that we have managed completely to confuse the public. At the present time, the average person, concerned person, feels totally disoriented, with no handles, no methods of getting hold of what they should be doing. And the consequence is an incredibly rapidly declining degree of trust in public institutions and private institutions because of their failures, and a rapidly gathering speed decline in hope in this culture. Now, why do people have these different science fiction views? Well, the first thing to say is that all of them are based on unprovable first assumptions. One of the things we know, although we don't often talk about it in academic worlds, is that you cannot come up with a theory of knowledge that is not based on some unprovable first assumption. Therefore, there is no magic route of deciding which of these views is correct. And there is no way of arguing between them. All you can do is recognize them and make your own decision as to which makes sense to you. Now, I believe you can go further than that, but certainly not at the present time. The first of these views says that we can anticipate that the future will be like the past, only better. The argument essentially is that there are no forces that are visible to the people making this argument which show why there should be major change. And as things have been going in this direction for 200 years, well, why shouldn't they go on going in this direction? And Herman Kahn and Daniel Bell and nearly all of the well-known futurists, people with reputations and prestige, hold that point of view. They essentially say the drives of the industrial era will continue for an unlimited period of time, at least long enough so that you in school will not have to change the view that you hold. The second viewpoint is the one that is known probably best under the Club of Rome viewpoint and the limits to growth. The statement is that you cannot continue in the same direction for an unlimited period of time without fundamental change developing. This is the same argument that Malthus made in the 19th century. It's the same argument, essentially, that the Students for a Democratic Society made in the 60s. And, in my opinion, it is no more than a tautology. If you continue growth in one direction for a sufficient period of time, you are then faced with the necessity for change. Denis Gabor really stated the whole thesis of the Club of Rome in very simple language. He did it in one paragraph as opposed to a rather long and lengthy book. He said, in today's world, all curves are exponential. That means, all know what a population growth curve looks like. The curve keeps on going up faster and faster. That's an exponential curve. It is only in mathematics that exponential curves grow to infinity. In real life, they either break down catastrophically or they saturate gently. It is our duty as thinking men to move towards a gentle saturation, even though this poses us with new and very difficult problems. I honestly do not believe that that argument is challengeable, but I may be wrong. I do not believe that anybody who now looks at reality that can believe that we can continue in the same directions. And I suspect that in your heads, many of you have reached that conclusion. But I suspect that equally much on the basis of experience that when you make your decisions, you are still acting as though growth will continue for an indefinite period into the future. And I am reasonably certain from discussion, talks, experiments, that most of you in college, even if you have recognized that the world and the culture is going to be incredibly different, are still assuming that your own personal lives are going to be just like those of your parents. You're going to leave school, you're going to get a job, you're going to get married, have 1.9 kids, retire at the age of 65, and etc. We have not started thinking about fundamental change. The third model is really the model that was put forward by Jonathan Livingston Seagull and Charles Reich. And that is, if only we would take thought, we could all learn to dive at 400 miles an hour. Man and the environment is infinitely and immediately malleable. And I'm afraid it's fairly obvious that I don't have very much sympathy for the viewpoint. But I think that to believe that man is not an animal is one of the most dangerous of all fallacies. I did not say he was only an animal, although there are times when I think that I prefer the morals of my Siamese cats to the morals of some human beings. But he is certainly an animal. And to assume that our long-run genetic heritage can be changed simply because we decide it would be nice is, to me, profoundly stupid. And takes us away from all of the real challenges which we face. The fourth view, which I hold, is that we, for better or worse, decided not to be dolphins. See, the dolphins are said, and I see no reason to disbelieve this, to have as much brains as we do. The dolphins decided to stay in the sea and to adapt themselves superbly to the sea. And we decided to make the world over. And having decided to do that, we cannot simply say it was a mistake. That's not saying it was, but it's not, in my opinion, a viable option. We have a population of 3.8 billion people approximately, the certainty of large-scale starvation in the world, which can only be avoided by intelligent, creative management of the Earth's resources using all the skills and knowledge we presently possess. The statement that technology is evil is a statement which would condemn millions of people, hundreds of millions of people to die. And I suspect that very few people would survive if we permit large-scale famine to develop throughout the world. The consequence of large-scale famine throughout the world would be that the world would divide between the rich and the poor countries. And that happens also to be between the white and the non-white nations of the world. And if that should happen, I am not very optimistic about those dynamics being reversible. We stand at an extraordinary moment in history, in my opinion. It may not look like that in 10 years' time because we may have failed. And the historians who will still be writing history in the middle of the ruins will be saying, well, it turned out that the West was indeed caught in the same classical historical pattern which resulted in the fall of Rome, the fall of Greece, the fall of Egypt, an inability to cope with major change. See, Toynbee may be, as historians say, a very bad historian, but he has surely demonstrated that cultures confronted with massive change usually do not adapt, but collapse. And I would suspect that the primary and first movement in that collapse is a lack and a loss of human concern. And we seem to have that in full measure. We cannot get concerned about major famine in sub-Saharan Africa, which is already going on and has been going on for about 2 years. For all the attention we pay it, it might as well not be there. We cannot get concerned about the quasi-certainty of large-scale famine in India and other countries who we, the West, convinced that there was a green revolution, which never was a green revolution, it was a fertilizer revolution. And we destroyed the patterns by which certain amounts of food could be produced in traditional ways to come up with models that were designed for fully industrialized countries. And now we say, oh, we're sorry. You mean say there isn't enough fertilizer around? Well, you know, we're very sorry. And that's about as far as it goes. I would suggest to you that if we are going to survive, we will have to recognize that we are living in a period which is very similar to the shift from the agricultural era to the industrial era. Only this time, instead of some 5 or 6 generations, it is going to happen in 1 generation. Indeed, it is happening in our generation, and perhaps you can say in our decade. Now, I'm sorry that that boggles the mind. It boggles mine. But I'm not creating events. And let me warn you against a fairly common human characteristic. In the old days, we cut off the head of people who brought us bad news. Well, we decided that isn't very humane. But we still get just as angry with people who report on realities that we don't want to hear. I did not create this reality. In fact, I probably spent quite a lot of time trying to change it. I spent my time trying to change it not in terms of what I can do, but in terms of how do we build a system by which many of us, potentially all of us, can be involved in the change process. See, I decided a long time ago that no one person was going to make any significant difference to the dynamics of this culture. No one person can bring about significant and important change. Therefore, it's a question of whether we in some way can unite to bring about change. Now that implies certain things. It implies, first of all, that we move away from a goal orientation to a process orientation. Because so long as we come into a room with a goal, we will never learn to talk to each other, because I will come in as an economist, and somebody will come in as an ecologist, and somebody will come in as a businessman, and somebody will come in as a developer, and we will all say we have our goals. And our goals are definitionally, as you have been discovering in a certain housing development around here, non-compatible. And as long as the format of that meeting is how do each of us win over you, we end up in what becomes a magnificent lose-lose situation, where everybody loses. The only way we can conceivably break out of this model is to come to places within a process orientation and to say, here we are with a situation, how do we all get something out of it? Now, we don't have the skills for that, we don't have the commitment for it, we don't have the styles for it. And every one of our institutions that we have inherited from the industrial era is designed to make that either difficult or impossible. The university and the college is perhaps, most universities and colleges, because I am aware that you have solved all of your problems at this college, are designed so that they cannot deal with process. Colleges are, after all, designed still, despite everything we have done, to package students in pieces of paper which we call BA. And the ideal student is still the one who will allow himself to be placed on the conveyor belt at the beginning of the year and be rolled along quietly until he comes off at the other end with the neatest, tidiest, and unscrounched piece of paper. Now that's not a knock at students or teachers or administrators. I'm talking about the pressures of the culture, the pressures of the way the institution works. And again, the only answer is by coming in process terms, to talk to each other about how we get out of this situation, and not having students coming in and saying, well, if only the teachers would behave well, and the teachers coming in and say, if only the administration was more reasonable, and so it goes round. We have somehow to learn in this area, as in every other area, to talk to each other. This also implies a model in which we have diversity and not equality. How anybody ever managed to come up with a world dream in which we should all be equal is something about which I am more and more amazed. I cannot imagine anything more terrible than being equal with any one of you. And I hope that you couldn't imagine anything more terrible than being equal with me. You see, that comes out of exactly the same mindset that drove us into an ecology which we may have made so non-diverse that it may not be able to survive. We are now learning that diversity is the primary need for any functioning ecological system. It is equally true that diversity is a primary need for any social system. Now, that gets a little bit complicated, however, because any particular part of the total social system needs to have a reason why it works together. Needs, in our jargon, to have what we call a community myth. It needs to have a purpose. And what we are talking about, therefore, is a range of communities with different styles which break out perhaps of the most fundamental of all human patterns, which is that we are good and they are bad. And at the moment they are bad simply because they are different. We have got to, I am quite sure, if we are going to survive, overcome that perception. You see, diversity and difference to me is the most exciting and important thing in the world because it permits me to learn from you fast, because you know parts of the universe and the world that I do not know, and vice versa. Therefore, to me, diversity is not threatening, but very exciting, very positive, and my perception of personal growth is my perception and your perception of the widest range of universes that you can possibly comprehend. And the reason that the science fiction fear of boredom in this new era is so false is that there are far more universes than any one of us can possibly discover in a lifetime. It really is true that when you start learning, you find out that there are more things to learn every day. But that doesn't bother you because you say, I learn what I can. But there's always something ahead of you, some challenge, which you have not yet reached. I could go on for a long time, as some of you know who've had the misfortune to listen to me. I try not to do Bucky Fuller speeches, but there's so much to say. The communications era is not like the industrial era. A very small idea of the scale of differences between the traditional American and the traditional Japanese culture. And if somebody said to me, describe Japan, I would be perfectly entitled to you to say, I can't describe Japan. Maybe if you go for 6 months there, you might begin to understand what makes the Japanese culture tick. If you're going to live in the future in this new and different world which I'm talking about, you're going to have to decide to live there because it's the only way to discover it. You discover a culture by creating it in this case. Now, certain rather important things follow from what I've said. The first thing is that we are trying, I believe, to do something which is literally and totally ahistoric. Something that has never been achieved before. I know of no culture which has tried consciously to create a radically different myth from the one it presently has. Our saving possibility is that it is quite possible that the myth we need is not nearly as different from the American Constitution as would appear at first sight. In fact, if you go back and read the Constitution, and if you go back even more and read the debates about the Constitution, you begin to wonder how we created the society we have in 1974. One of the things that the Founding Fathers said with rather great heat and tried to build into the Constitution was that factionalism would destroy the country. Is it possible that they were right, and that factionalism is indeed destroying the country? They tried to build a political system which was not a win-lose political system. Certainly at the top level, the choice of president and vice president was taken outside, if you read the Constitution. Political factionalism. The attempt was to search for the competent person who could take that role. There was a recognition that, in my jargon, elections can easily be anti-democratic. That may sound harsh, but if you look at what our last 3 presidential elections, and it's equally true in my own country of Britain, have done, we have degraded the understanding of the key issues, not enhanced it. Elections are based at the moment on the assumption that people vote against people and not for them. And therefore, the less obvious the position of the candidate, the more chance they have of winning that election. Now, what do I hope has happened this morning? I do not hope that you have agreed with everything I have said. That would simply prove that you hadn't been listening, or you had been listening without any critical faculty, because I have said enough different things that you ought to have disagreed with some of them. I do not hope that you have got a nice, clean, clear message where you can say, Mr. Theobald believes. I do hope that you have begun, and if you've already begun, which most of you have, continued to think about how each one of us is going to deal with this crisis in which we're placed. And the way we've arranged this day is designed to make that possible, as opposed to the normal conference where you go and hear your keynote speaker and then you rush off and you hear 3 other speakers and then you rush off and hear 6 other speakers. And by the end of the day, you have so much input that it is impossible for you to sort anything out in your head. What we're going to do, Normal will tell you the details, but what we're going to do is for you to go away and have an opportunity to come up with the nastiest question that you can for me. How much of what I said stands up and how much of it is a con game? And then this afternoon, we're going to talk about how we could begin to deal with these issues in both community and college. And I mean deal with them, not just have nice plans for another conference or another meeting. How could we produce something big enough to make a difference? And that, of course, means cultural innovation on a large scale. We're not just talking about doing the same thing we know how to do once more. We're talking about how do we create new models, new institutions in quotation marks, which permit us to change the culture in the very short time we have available. Now, I'm not talking about us changing the culture and say, us 500 people have come up with a groovy model of what a good society would be like, because we've done too much of that. How do we free people up to dream and to bring what they want, and those people include us, into action? We're not talking about taking everybody and saying, you be like us. And the worst thing we've been doing for the past years is to say, we will do good for you whether you want it or not. I think we've run out of time for that route. Our time is to help people to grow themselves to find out what they want. And that's a very different style. Now, I would like to propose a norm for today, which I would like to see go through all future conferences, but that's up to you. But at least for this morning and this afternoon, we will try to avoid all applause. Applause is another industrial era trick. It is designed to wake up the audience so that they know it's time to go home. It is designed to convince the speaker that he has at least not maddened the people enough that they won't do something to make him feel good. And above all, it's designed to put closure on the event. It's designed to say, I came and I listened to Theobald and I paid him by applauding him. Therefore, oh, forget it, it happened. I can't talk to you unless you're listening. I don't mean just sitting here in rows. I mean listening. The speech is a lousy format, and I have stated, and I hope I can make it work, that I will make no speeches after 1976. But even in a speech, it is possible to communicate. And I believe we degrade communication by assuming that you're on one side of some fence and I'm on the other side. We're in this very much together. I can only talk to you because you're here, just as you can only listen because you're here. And therefore, if we can begin to look at each other's really smaller communication techniques, to watch each other's bodies, to watch each other's gestures, to watch each other's faces, begin to understand whether or not we are getting through when we talk. Maybe we can symbolize this in the decision that we will not go in for the business of applause. Now, if anybody starts applauding, I'll know they don't approve. Thank you very much.
We will now move into your opportunity.
If you want to announce, that's what I'm going to do.
Okay. May we reconvene, please? And could somebody go outside to bring in any people who are sort of still deliberating? If there are any more questions, I'll take them for Mr. Theobald. Okay. Our procedure will be that he will shuffle the questions so that he makes sure he gets a fair distribution, or hopefully fair distribution, from the various groups. And so he will take the questions in a random order.
Well, we have a full pack of cards here, and I suspect that any one of these questions could take 40 minutes, which is what we have. What I'm going to try and do is read the question and give short answers. And obviously they're not going to be satisfactory because, in a sense, each relevant question exposes the whole issue of what the communications era is, so you can, in a sense, make a full lecture off any starting point. What I shall do is I shall hold them here, I shall read one, I shall then cut them and take the one that comes to the top. I promise you that this is not cooked. If I can't answer the question, I'll tell you that too. Regarding goals and process orientation, are we talking about a non-goal goal or temporary goals, or where do goals fit in? Well, it's a very difficult question. We've been having all sorts of hassles with it in the last week. I think I'm going to answer by analogy. If you bring up children, do you have goals for them or not? I suspect it's exactly the same sort of question. Yes, there are some goals, but they're process goals, and you have them as long as they look good, and if they don't look good, you drop them. To shift the language slightly, a guy called Max Ways, who wrote for Fortune, said to me, all the good decisions I have been made in my life are the ones where I didn't make decisions. In other words, it grew. I suspect if a goal is something that forces you away from your life process, it's bad. If it helps you towards your life process, it's good, and that's as true of institutions as it is of people. Now, it's very obvious in that answer, and I'm sure there are going to be many others, that our language doesn't carry the issues we're dealing with. And I'm not going to pretend it does. We need some very major linguistic rethinking, and I don't know very much of what's going on. Somebody once said that the major problem with Hayakawa leaving and going to San Francisco State was he wrecked the general semantics movement. The problem of process, what is it? How do we come to a win-win situation? Process is something where you start something and you find out how to do it. And you, in a sense, know you want to create a better society. But you don't know what a better society means. Again, you come back to a child. You don't know what a good child is, but you have a sense of when you're moving in the right direction. A win-win philosophy I don't know much about yet, except in the groups I work in. And I think what you do is you start trying to find out when things work out and everybody feels that they come out feeling good. I suspect that's done by creating task forces in which you have a task and everybody can gain out of being involved and that task is common. That the task is done with some concern about other human beings besides the people in the task force. You say we must change rapidly, however, can people accept the sort of rapid change you advocate? Well, a good deal better, I suspect, than the sort of rapid change they're getting at the present time. If they got a choice of being dehumanized or humanized, I suspect it's easier to be humanized than dehumanized. And that's the only option. We haven't gotten a choice about whether we're going to have rapid change or not. That's not an open option. If that was an option, I'd go for it. It's a great option. We can decide to change very rapidly into a dehumanized culture or a humanized culture. The odds are we will change into a dehumanized culture. I'm arguing it doesn't have to happen. I'm arguing one thing further, and that is that an awful lot of people have made the decision that they'd like to be human, and there aren't many structures in which it can be done. And I watched the Pavlovian response this morning at the end of that lecture, and I know some people weren't turned on, but I saw a lot of people who had been turned on feel that they had to go to classes because otherwise what would their professors say to them? And if we're that dehumanized on this campus, because that is purely a Pavlovian reaction, we ain't made very much progress. If kids feel that by not going to a class they're in deep trouble, and if teachers feel that by letting their students listen to Bob Theobald instead of to them for one class they're going to be destroyed, we really haven't got very far. Is there a place for legal controls in a process-oriented society? Will you take no for an answer? I don't think so. Law is a single-channel answer to complex questions. If you remember, the original jury of 12 good men and true was 12 people who knew the defendant, not 12 objective people. The idea was an answer fit for the situation of the person, not fit for the crime. If it's true that we're going to have to move criminals back into community, as has been suggested, and it's something that I agree with, then we're going to have to produce situations in which that criminal can be rehabilitated, and that is not a legal question, it's a social question. And I think we're seeing the inadequacy of law in another place. The reserve decisions are so obviously inadequate at every level, so that if you close the plant down, who gets clobbered? Not the firm, because it's pretty clear that the firm may very well have wanted to close down anyway, but the workers. Well, if that's the best the legal system can do, I suspect it isn't very good. How do I combat my orientation to the status quo lifestyle? By doing something small that moves you out of it. That's really all I can say. Do something you can handle plus 10% for risk. And don't try and change the world yesterday. It's our greatest failure. Find something that just moves you a little bit outside what you're doing at the present time and get some pleasure out of what you're doing, and that will move you and you will see something else you can do. If you try and do it all at once, you end up doing exactly the same thing. Revolutions, whether personal or social, do not work. They simply bring you back to the same point. That's why so much of what we did in the 60s didn't work, because we assumed all we had to do was to say we'd run a different place. Somebody asked me about communes. Communes don't work in general because people assume that by moving into a commune they are freed from all of the constraints with which they were brought up. You've got to recognize that each one of us is trapped in the status quo. I've been lucky. I've now spent about 12 years working in a communication era situation, and it's taken me that long to begin to lick the success criteria I was inculcated with. If anybody thinks they're not still caught up in it, they're kidding themselves. I am still caught up in that. Some of you ought to leave, I feel sure. Who wants to go? Nobody? Help! School will break down. How can you move from goal orientation to process? What solutions are you offering? Come this afternoon. And bring some of your friends. Assuming there should be a futurist party as a guide to sound development toward the future, how can political backing be secured for such a process? I think that we can't do it through politics as presently defined. I can't buy into a futurist party. I can buy into a futurist movement, and again, we'll be talking about what that means this afternoon. I think that the key there is to start doing things and to involve people, and I really do agree very strongly with what Naftalin said, that the business of creating the future is the creation of connections, the finding of people. Because if you believe that solutions get found by competent people, then the more competent people you can find, the more easily, the more likely you are to be able to solve any problem or to take advantage of any possibility that emerges. What's exciting about this town is that there probably are as many connections in this town and city as anywhere else, except, as far as I can see, there is a complete lack of communication between the twin cities. I think there is an impervious wall between the two sides of that river. I really do. I've come to that conclusion, having visited Minneapolis many times, and I never get pulled onto the other side of the river, and I suspect it's exactly the same thing. I think this is extraordinarily unhealthy. It's about time we began to worry about how those two cities do become the twin cities in some meaningful sense. How to convince people of the urgency of our current situation, that our survival is at stake and that we are masters of our destiny. Do it. I think that people need hope. I think the reason people won't look is because they're afraid. If you've got a choice of denying that we are in a problem or being powerless, feeling powerless to do something about it, most of us decide to deny the evidence of reality. You will give people hope that something can be done. My guess is that they will begin to recognize that there is a problem, but they will not until they have that. And most people are feeling extraordinarily hopeless, and the barriers against communication are rising all the time because of that hopelessness. So find ways to give people hope. Don't, in general, go in and try and tell them how bad things are. They know it. They're just not prepared to recognize it because it's too threatening. You stated that there was an urgent need to help the starving peoples of Africa, but we cannot decide what is good for them. But we are not to decide what is good for them. What process do you recommend to solve the problem? I'm not hung up on providing food to people. I don't think starvation is an answer that any intelligent person can recommend as an answer to world problems. There are a lot of things we can argue about. But anybody who believes that the way to get our problem under control is to starve 1 billion people, which has been proposed, is, to put it bluntly, out of his skull. Because there won't be any world left if we try to do that. Because poor people are not about to allow us to stay around while we starve them. If you think they can't destroy us, I can produce the evidence which can show they can. Now, there is, as somebody said, the very good question in there of how do you do it without the foreign aid mentality. We better start thinking about it, but you don't wait to supply them with food until you've solved the foreign aid problem, because then it's going to be too late. There's a lovely science fiction story in, I think, our book, The Failure of Success, about two planets who go to war with Earth, and as you would expect, Earth wins the war. And one planet comes down and very gracefully accepts foreign aid, and the other one refuses it. And in 20 years, the planet that accepts foreign aid is in very good shape, and the other one is in terrible shape. In 50 years, the situation is reversed. We're going to have to learn that lesson, but that doesn't allow us to say, oh, we've just discovered that foreign aid isn't in your best interest, so we're going to starve you to death. I could see us doing it, by the way. I mean, it'll be a nice rationalization, and in fact, I suspect a little bit of that rationalization is around. Look at our latest foreign aid bill. How can we convince people to give up what they have? There is no need for people with wealth and power to adapt and change. I find it very often easier to talk with people with wealth and power about change than I do with middle-income people. Don't ask me why, but it's a reality that I know about. The question is, as my wife put it in an editorial in our trend letter, Futures Conditional, what do you define as success? Maybe wealth and power aren't very successful, so you look for something else instead. I think that the places I find a willingness to change are precisely with a number of people with very large amounts of wealth and power, because they have found that they don't generate very much human satisfaction. And if I think that if we could get, say, 20 corporate heads together from across this country, the ones who really care, and really give them an opportunity to understand what we're talking about, I would have much less trouble teaching them than I do many other groups. And I'm saying teaching in the sense of giving people an opportunity to learn. Because they're pragmatists and they realize the world is falling apart. Some of you know Gwyn Jones Davis. And Gwyn, when I first came to town, taught me that the rich and the poor can work together because they're both pragmatists. It's the great middle class that's going to kill us. How do you deal with the inconsistency that massive change is destructive while suggesting it? I told you, I didn't create the world, friends. I didn't advocate that we created this mess. If anybody can tell me how to stop the change process, I will be delighted to go along. Look, I'm very much of an anthropologist. I am highly aware of the risks involved in what is being proposed. I can only tell you that in my judgment, the risks of moving towards humanization are less than the risks we're running at the present time, where I believe we're moving towards dehumanization. But I know of nobody, I think literally, who is suggesting that the pace of change can be slowed down in the immediate future or in any short-run future. It's a question not of whether we have change, but the direction of change. In a non-factionalized society, what kind of decision-making or authority structure do you propose? We have an authority structure based on structural authority position. In theory, if I hold a title, I can make a decision regardless of whether it is good. And for me to come into the man with power and to say, why did you make that decision, please justify it, is a non-relevant thing, because he made that decision because he was president. What has happened to us is that structural authority has broken down. And whether we like it or not, there is no longer any way for us to run a structural authority society. We have to create what I believe one can call a sapiential authority society based on competence, knowledge, wisdom. And those are put together in task forces so that one operates with people who are competent. Now, this is not elitist in any conventional sense, because I am not saying that all competent people are white males between the age of 45 and 65. I'm saying that at the moment we say that the only competent people in our culture are between 45 and 65 and white and male. I don't believe that we can escape from the necessity for competence in decision making, but I do believe that we must recognize that everybody is the most competent person in their own life. I have no right to come to any one of you, nor do any of you have the right to come to me and to say, I know what is good for your life. And therefore, in the end, we are all sapiential authorities about our own lifestyle. And the sooner we start teaching our children that, the more likely we are to produce a culture. And again, think of what our schools and our colleges say about people's competence to run their own lifestyle. And the day they go into kindergarten, they're told, by the styles we set up, the teacher knows best. I was talking to somebody yesterday who said to watch, got kids I think of 5 and 9, to watch the desire to learn, to be involved, to decision make, go out of people's eyes as they go through school. It's a really horrifying experience. One of the things I'm waiting for is when we are going to have a movement to abolish compulsory school attendance. How are you going to have competent worldwide management and yet have diversity? And aren't they incompatible? Read Tegg's 1994, which is one of our books. No, I don't think they are incompatible. In fact, I think they are essential if we are going to survive. The only way I know how to manage is to have as much diversity in the system as possible. Management becomes highly dangerous when you have similar people talking to each other because they don't know when you're going wrong. The Russian wheat deal would not have happened if we had had diversity in the management system, because somebody would have been able to say, but look, friends, there isn't any wheat left. What we had was a lot of very similar people in the Department of Agriculture, all of whom understood the wheat situation. Wrong. The reason why the Bureau of Indian Affairs continues to be the same incredibly immoral, and I use that word advisedly, place, is because you have a large number of very similar people in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so on. Process, as we discussed, it seems to mean so many different things. What the hell is it? Is process a time dimension? Yes, it's a lot of things. One of the things we tried to do was to turn words into one thing. They ain't, friends. In real life, words mean, Alice wasn't so far out. Words mean what you choose them to mean. And yes, I know if you push that too far, you lose the ability to discourse. But we've gone much too far the other way, where we stop all discourse by somebody coming in and saying, Mr. Theobald, if you could only explain exactly to us what you mean by process, I am sure that we are going to be able to make progress in this discussion. I say the moment you get me into that gig, I can no longer talk in any meaningful terms, because then you can stop me every time I try to get going. There are at least two communication styles, and they cannot occur in the same room at the same time. One is inter. Inter is logic. It is applicable when you know what the situation is, when you know what the goal is, and you know exactly what you want to achieve. And then it's important you can define your terms. The second language, which occurs when you want to dream up new realities, is what we call outer, once defined as blabbermouth languages written on psychic tissue paper. It is the process of dreaming a new reality into existence. It is quite different. And in that, it is fair to use process to mean very many different things. We have much too much inter and much too little outer in this world at the present time. We're trying to solve problems before we've even begun to define what the problems are we're trying to define. When we come back this afternoon, I'll talk to you about why we will be trying, and the things we're doing, to get people to come up with questions and not with answers. So a lot of this amazing amount, and I'm surprised, is in terms of process and goals. But we come nicely to a question which follows on. Can you define anything? Is anything concrete? No. Not really. The great flaw of the industrial era is believing that there is an objective reality. Objective realities come out of a Newtonian view of the universe, which was disproved, I hate to tell you, some 60 or 70 years ago. Yet the whole of our social sciences, the whole of our media, the whole of our communications are based on the assumption that there is such a thing as objective reality. Your whole schooling system is based on it. You come to school to learn a sufficient amount of objective truth to be classified as being worth a BA, and if you'll stay on longer, they'll give you a PhD. What you're measuring is people's capacity to learn, quote, facts. But facts depend on perception. Reality is subjective. Look around this hall and imagine that you are a giraffe or a cat or a flea, and I'm quite serious. Try and do it. Then think what would happen in terms of what you'd see if you change your sex or your age or your color. Recognize that even in this room you pick up a very tiny amount of the clues that exist. And then recognize that if you go out into that world, you're going to pick up not only a tiny amount, but a practically minuscule amount, which you structure out of your cultural experience. Every organism is inherently the center of his, her universe. And agreement is found by an agreement that in a particular situation we can agree within certain limits on what reality is. Yes, I can count the number of chairs in this room, 500. Or I can even count the number of bodies in this room, 500, the last time we were here. But that's not a particularly relevant piece of data for what I'm trying to do. I have to choose those pieces of reality that I want to deal with, and to call them facts is not particularly useful. I'm interested in relationships between people, people in the environment, people in their buildings, people in their community. Makes me look in very, very different directions. Now, if you want to tell me that that is a chair, I'm not going to argue with it. That's not the issue. Indeed, if I'm going to talk into with you, I will admit that there is such a thing as a car engine with a carburetor. But to me, that's trivial in the context in which we're presently talking. We're going to talk about changing the world. No, there are not facts, because our business is precisely to change the facts. Look, there was a great question, which was a factual question in the Middle Ages. How many angels could dance on the head of a pin? It was a great factual question. People spent a long time trying to come up with the factual answer to that question. We laugh now. The question of what the GNP is just about at the same level of abstruseness and irrelevance. How does one create community consciousness? Read Futures Conditional for March. Or Futures Conditional, I'll put a trend letter for February, because that's what we're trying to do. It would take much too long to answer that question. I've really got to talk about what we've done. And come back this afternoon, because again, we're going to talk about how you do create community consciousness, because we believe it's the critical thing. How do you create what we call situational? A language, and this is your third language or communication style, in which you can shorthand. A community is good if it has its own language. Not an exclusive language, but one which allows people to shorthand within that community, and also to feel good within that community. If the community doesn't have it, the community is not going to operate very well. Can a society exist when diversity and differences are so great? Don't we need a common philosophy? Interestingly, that was the end point of our book, Tegg's 1994. How do you reconcile diversity and the need for world myths? We've really decided it's a non-question since we wrote the book, because your myth is precisely the myth of diversity and its excitement. Or if you want to put it in different language, you resuscitate Catholic natural law, or religion, or system theory. And what you really say with Bishop Berkeley when somebody said to him, "I accept nature," is "you'd better." There's certain realities that man cannot break. He's been trying to break them for a long time, and if he tries to break them, he will destroy the web of nature and everything that keeps us alive. If we follow with the web of nature and the environment and the ecology, I suspect Teilhard de Chardin was quite right. We don't know where we're going to end up. And that's why I'm in the business, because I'd like to find out, and I think it might be very, very interesting. Because I'm quite sure that if we get through this transition, we are, as I think somebody has quoted, going to prove, mankind is going to prove to be the, or man is going to prove to be the missing link between ape and humanity. How is the change going to happen? Come back this afternoon. How can we deal with fundamental change when our basic biological and security needs have been denied us? I'm relating this to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. To me, change is the process of self-fulfillment, which is on the apex of our human needs. I agree. Unless we do satisfy people's need for food, clothing, and shelter, we are not able to deal with these issues. And if we say, well, we're going to all get very happy and groovy, but we're going to do it apart from the poor, both here and in the rest of the world, we aren't going to do very much of it. Because people don't aspire for self-actualization unless they have got their needs satisfied, and they cannot effectively aspire to self-actualization when other people cannot. It doesn't work. Do you believe in God? If so, do you believe he is the answer to men's problems, since he stands for love, tolerance, cooperation, etc.? Well, somebody asked me what process was. God obviously has at least as many meanings as process, and probably more. I believe in my defined sort of God, and I was brought up to believe that God was a gentleman with a long beard who had the answers to all of our problems. And that God I no longer believe in, but I do believe in a very classic definition of God. God exists when 2 or 3 people are gathered together in his name. If you want to make that secular, because I believe that morality and intelligence bring you to the same point, God exists when 2 or 3 people gather in the name of synergy. Synergy is the process by which 1 plus 1 equals more than 2. I do not believe that one human being can develop or imagine humanity. I believe he must work with other people, other organisms, and therefore I believe in God in the sense that I do not believe that we are self-sufficient. But I do not believe in a God who has our answers for us. I can get with the Lutheran idea of God breaking into the future, into the present from the future, and I've forgotten the right technical term, I'm sorry. But in the first issue of Futures Conditional, we printed a piece called Jonah. And to me, there was a really extraordinarily powerful image in which it was assumed that God discovered reality at the same time as we did. That when Einstein discovered relativity, so did God, and so on. And at least to me, that is closer to teaching me what I need to know at the moment than any other vision of God than I know. We, joined together, can be God. Now, I admit, obviously, that this is inadequate theology, but all theology is inherently inadequate because it just can't possibly be explained. But if God is something greater than oneself, yes, I definitely believe in God. What do you do with people who can't or will not cooperate? Ignore them and leave them alone. And you don't compel them to cooperate. One of our problems is we assume that everybody ought to agree with us, and if they don't, they're stupid. So we have a right to go out and say, cooperate, cooperate. And they say, but we don't want to cooperate with you, we disagree. And you say, well, we're wiser than you are, and there you are back in the same old bind. Find the people who are ready to move, and there are always more opportunities and challenges than you can possibly handle. You don't have to go out and compel the unwilling. You see, fortunately, you're not God, and I'm not God. There are other people around. Maybe somebody else can get those people to cooperate. Now, if you go in and tell them to cooperate and turn them off, next time somebody comes around who could tell them to cooperate because they'd be turned on by that person, they'll say, well, I heard Bob Theobald last week, and he's a dummy. You sound to me like him. I don't want anything to do with it. Don't try and solve problems you're not intelligent or wise enough to solve. Leave them alone, however important they look. But if you don't have the skills to solve them, in other words, if you do more than risk plus 10%, you'll simply make the system worse than it is. What do you mean by factionalism as compared to diversity of opinion? Diversity is something that a strong person has, but he is willing to compromise. Factionalism is something that a weak person has, and he is not prepared to listen to anybody else because he doesn't know whether he really holds the opinion or not. Strong people really don't have very much they have to hold on to survive. Weak people can't give up anything. Factionalism is a process whereby people get so head up on one particular thing that they think it is the end of the world if it doesn't happen. The end of the world doesn't happen that easily. And there's a great difference between diversity. I can compromise on many levels. There are a few things that you cannot get me to do, but very few. A weak person has an immense, sometimes a total number of things that he is not willing to do. In fact, one of the things that struck me as a European was how bad Americans still are, I think, at taking out ideas and looking at them out there and saying, that idea is not me. I can look at it. Maybe I'll decide it's no good and I'll take it out and throw it away. I think it's a skill we're going to have to learn. People feel that an idea is them. That's not them. It's something they inherited. They can look at it and say it's important or not important. Has this type of change never occurred before? Is it really ahistorical? Yes, I believe that very, very deeply. I've not yet found anybody who's come up with a historical parallel. I'd love to find one, but I don't think it exists. Where do you go to find priorities, pollution and hunger? I think that the idea of priorities is, again, another problem. Everything has to happen at once. So what you say is, who work on what? You don't go in and say, yes, I have decided that hunger is the key issue, and try and tell everybody that hunger is the key issue, because only a small proportion of the population will work on hunger. And you say, oh no, you can't work on health, it's not critical. But if we're talking about change everywhere, everything is critical. So the issue is not what are the priorities, but how do you coordinate between activities in different fields. What is this myth we are trying to create? If we knew, we wouldn't have to create it. That's the whole point. We've tried to get a little bit of it in the March issue of Futures Conditional. But creating myth is a process of creating myth. You're not in the business of going out and saying, hey, I've got a myth. Do you want to buy it? You know, myth is not a packageable item. We've got to find it for ourselves. What do we mean when we say we want to humanize society? That's what the myth is going to be when we eventually find out. What lifestyle do you live that demonstrates what you have said today? Have you personally dealt with fundamental change? Not as much as I'd like to. I live a relatively non-competitive lifestyle. My secretaries tell me, I don't call them secretaries, but they'd be secretaries in the industrial era, that I do my fair share of the work that nobody enjoys. I think everybody who works for us because they want to, as well as because they earn money, and they need to earn money because that's still a necessity in this society. My wife and I work reasonably successfully together, and we sure don't have many hassles at the level of who washes the dishes. Now, of course, I haven't got far enough, but I think it's reasonably difficult to catch me out in terms of a very crass distinction. And probably the crassest gap between what I believe and what I'm doing is with this today. And that's largely because I don't think people are yet ready to listen unless you do put them on a pedestal. People need the authority, and I try to break it, but if you don't play it at all, they get terribly, terribly upset. So I have to come in that way and then try and say, look, it's a lousy way to try to operate. Where I get clobbered is when I try to relate to the industrial era. Do reasonably well at home and in my own office because I can plan my own lifestyle. I find it incredibly difficult. All right, let's see, one final one. Here we go. What place would religion... No, we've dealt with that to some extent. You've been at this for a number of years. Where do you see the bottlenecks, and how can we get the media involved? Good place to stop. Well, the bottlenecks to start with are all of us. Pogo is perfectly right. We have met the enemy, and them is us. It's the key set of bottlenecks. But I think you can go a little bit further. The bottleneck we have are people who deal with symbols and not with reality. People who look at unemployment rates, gross national products, the whole shooting match of theory and data that prevent us from seeing people as real. And the problem is that nearly everybody who communicates, politicians, media, academia, bureaucracy, the only people who have real access to the communication channels of this culture, see the world in symbol terms, in data terms, in theory terms. Those of us who care about people have no channels. Go into a bookstore and you think about the people who write in this area. They're buried under sociology or economics or political science. Why don't we go into every bookstore in town and ask them politely to create a new world bookshelf or some other jargon so we can put this stuff together? Why don't we begin to work with papers and magazines and the media and say, how do you get this sort of stuff across? Because it is not news. I talk to UP, I talk to the American Society of Newspaper Editors, and they say to me, Bob, at the end of the lecture, a lot of them, that was fascinating, really groovy stuff. I see them a couple of months later, and I say, I read your paper, and I read your paper after I made my speech, and you didn't have anything about it in there. Well, why did it happen? And they said to me, oh, but it wasn't news. And the best ones of them smile rather wryly at me as they make that statement, because they're the people who run that newspaper. The news is a way of selling papers and keeping people watching television. Therefore, every event must be the biggest event since the beginning of time, because otherwise, why will they turn on tomorrow? There's no place for trends, no place for development of humanity. It's not news. And the argument that you must only report things that are news because the things that aren't news are not important seems to me to be absolutely destructive of everything that we believe in, because what people hear about is the way they believe the world works. Why are we so pessimistic? Because the only thing that is reported on in this culture is all of the things we should justifiably be pessimistic about. And when we do report on things that we shouldn't, they sort of get buried on page 77. Under the League of Women Voters held an interesting meeting at which 50 people were present. So I think what we begin to do is we find out how to communicate and be concerned at the human level. And I come back again, and this is where we start this afternoon. How do we create connections? And how do we create new dreams of what we want, and I believe it's a bicentennial issue, America's third century to be? And I'm going to come in with some very clear-cut, pragmatic possibilities. And I hope over lunch that you will think about the following question. Am I willing, if I become convinced that the sort of things that Bob Theobald puts forward are feasible, and that's something you have a right to judge, am I willing to put some of my life over the next year or 2 years into changing the society or not? Because what we usually do is everybody has a groovy time and everybody says, hey, that was great. And everybody goes away and says, yes, of course we're going to put time into this. And then the days go by and they find out, oh, but we've got so many things we have to do. And it drops. I'd much rather we come out of this afternoon with 10 or 15 or 20 people who mean it than with 50 people who say, yes, it sounds groovy, and who drop out. The dynamics are so much better if we start from the people who are going to stick. I'm going to ask one other thing. I hope that we're going to come out with some pragmatic answers. They're going to involve, if all goes well, the Twin Cities and the state. So if you know some people who ought to be here, go and use the telephone. It exists for that purpose, to communicate with people. And get them here and give them an opportunity to be involved and to put their input into what they want to see happen. Because there is a chance that we will build something significant in this city, in these cities, in this state. And it starts from the beginning, because it's rather surprising how much of what one talks about at the beginning tends to end up as what you do. So I hope some of you will come back this afternoon. Of course, you all remember we said that there would be no applause, right? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sanders. Dr. Anderson, Dr.